guest today began his career as an investigator for the Internal Revenue Service, focused on reducing financial fraud. He later served as a special agent for the Office of the Inspector General in the General Services Administration, investigating public corruption. Before the governor appointed our guest today, he served as a partner in the law firm of Piper Rudnick. He joined Central Management Services in 2003 as assistant director and was named director in June 2005. Our guest today is a graduate of Marquette University, earned a law degree from John Marshall Law School, and holds an MBA from Northwestern University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the City Club of Chicago, the Director of Central Management Services, Paul Campbell. Paul? All yours. Have some fun up there.
I tell you, it would have been ironic if CMS couldn't have got the PowerPoint to work. That was good timing, Jeff. Thank you, Jay, for that introduction, and thank you to the City Club for the opportunity to speak here today. The City Club is perhaps the perfect group for me to address my topic today because it's made up of leaders from both the public and the private sector. I want to ask you one simple question today. Do you believe you can run the business of government like a business? Take a moment, if you would, and just reflect on that question. Based on your experience, do you think it's possible? I have been traveling all around the state for the last year, talking to business chambers, public leaders, business leaders, and quite frankly, I'm surprised at the number of people who are offended by that concept, who insist that the private sector must be different because it's not driven by the bottom line and the profit motive. And I recognize that in government, there's a double bottom line, one of both fiscal responsibility and social equity. But surely when you're looking at the fiscal bottom line, one must look at good business practices. Moreover, there's a lot of talk right now about reforming the way government operates. And I'd like to share with you some of the challenges we've had over these last few years in doing just that. In addition, it may heighten your enjoyment somewhat over some of the more outlandish things that I think you're going to hear between now and November. As I was considering how best to present these challenges, I came across a cartoon that I thought was appropriate. Its underlying message said, nobody would try anything new if they understood the consequences. Therefore, all progress is based on faulty assumptions. And if you look at the example up there, you'll see Dilbert talking to his colleague saying, I call it a personal computer, and it will eliminate paper while freeing us all from tedious and unfulfilling jobs. While it may sound a bit cynical, the idea does resonate at CMS, and I speak from experience. 3 years ago, Governor Blagojevich gave CMS a challenge: run the business of government like a business. CMS accepted that challenge, and the leadership from the department came largely from the private sector. Places like McKinsey and SBC and Procter & Gamble and Motorola. And we were eager to bring to government best practices from the private sector. Maybe a little bit too eager at times, and I'll admit at times maybe a bit naive. There were those within government that said what we couldn't accomplish what we wanted to within state government. But I continue to believe that the faulty assumptions that we operated under helped us, because I believe they were wrong to say that what we were trying to do was impossible. What really saved us in the end was the fact that we focused on that core value, the mantra from the governor to run the business of government like a business. When the governor was inaugurated in 2003, he faced largely uncontrolled spending and a government payroll that was getting more and more bloated. This administration has accomplished a great deal. We have reduced our personnel by over 13,000 employees. Our savings initiatives have saved more than $500 million. $500 million. Enabling the governor to put more resources into healthcare, public safety, and education without raising sales and income taxes. I'll go into that in a little more detail later, but what I want to focus on today is that question I asked earlier. Can you run the business of government like a business? Is it possible for government to operate, government operations to conform to private sector principles? Just to cut to the chase, I believe the answer is yes, but I recognize that the jury is still out for many of you. Before we get too far in the answer, though, let's talk about some basic definitions. When we talk about the business of government at CMS, we're referring to back office functions, the administrative functions, the shared services that are critical to making any government operate, or any business for that matter. I'm talking about key functions like purchasing and real estate, legal services, human resources, phone systems, and information technology. In the past, every state agency managed these back office functions largely on their own. So the director of DCFS would be worried about a broken pipe or an outdated data center rather than focusing on his core mission, which is to keep at-risk kids off the street. We often heard a statistic that was cited that some agency directors were spending as much as 50% of their time on administrative functions rather than on their core mission. Well, at CMS, improving those basic business functions is our core mission. And we do that primarily in two ways. First, centralization. We've consolidated many of those functions centrally into central management services. And second, influence. We've brought our business focus to functions that should remain under the direct control of agency directors, and yet we believe we can influence them with best practices from the private sector. Another word for centralization is, of course, consolidation. The simple private sector practice of consolidating like functions from various business units and creating an enterprise-wide model to administer them. This presents opportunities to streamline processes and introduce efficiencies, to do things better and for less money. That's probably a good, if simple, definition that I can provide today of shared services. In fact, our success in this area was recently recognized by the Council of State Governments when they gave us an award as a national model, the 2005 Innovations Award, just a few months ago. Let me tell you a bit about how shared services works at CMS. We manage telecommunications and information technology for the entire state. At CMS, we control the telecom system plus the IT infrastructure, the boxes and the wires, if you will, which I believe is best managed from a centralized perspective. The agencies still develop agency-specific software, mission-critical software that they know better than we do. But it still lends itself to a governance process that allows us to eliminate millions in dollars of unnecessary spending on unnecessary systems. We handle purchasing. CMS serves as a central procurement agency for the state's $14 billion procurable spend. Now, we don't spend all that money ourselves, but we do influence the vast majority of it. We also manage the state's business enterprise program, serving more opportunities for women-owned and minority businesses around the state. We manage the state's real estate, which includes 60 million square feet of space, 50 million owned, 10 million leased, with 7,000 facilities around the state. We serve as the state's personnel department for more than 57,000 employees, and we administer benefits for state employees and their dependents touching 350,000 lives. We run and maintain the 12,000 fleet vehicle. We also manage labor relations and communications, the internal audit function, workers' compensation, and provide legal services to state agencies in the area of labor, contractual services, and personnel. Collectively, all that activity represents the business of government. So what do we mean by running it like a business? Now, most of you are business people, so I don't have to tell you what running a business is like. But it's important for today's discussion for us to agree on a common vocabulary. Our definition of running it like a business has 5 components, which I'll briefly describe before I share examples of each one. You could summarize the 5 components with the acronym FACTS. Now, this is government after all, folks, so we need an acronym for pretty much everything. FACTS: financial control, accountability, change, transparency, and service. Now, I could spend you hours telling you the facts of how far apart we were on all of these dimensions. But let me just say we weren't close on any of them. Business and government operations were about as far apart as many Cubs and Sox fans are as we kick off another baseball season here in Chicago. The first component is financial control. No business will survive without strong financial control and a vigilant campaign against wasteful spending. Our efforts to save money sprang from our belief that we can buy smarter and rein in unnecessary spending that was rampant in the state for decades. In the past, financial controls were at best sorely lacking. Saving money simply was not a priority during the heady days of budget surpluses and Illinois First grants. Let me tell you a little bit about what we've done these last 3 years. I will describe both meaningful results and a groundbreaking process. Our efforts saved taxpayers $529 million in these last 2 years alone. That's more than $500 million in procurement and IT and fleet and legal services, just to name a few. Now, this effort was certainly not done by CMS alone. This was a cross-agency collaborative effort under the administration led by CMS at a time when the state was in a fiscal crisis, facing a more than $5 billion budget deficit. These savings helped the governor to direct greater resources towards health care and public safety and education and away from government waste. As some of you know, these savings have been the subject of spirited debate within state government. People have questioned our savings, they've questioned our documentations, at times it's as they've practically questioned our parentage. It was nice, actually, for a change to have people arguing about how much money government saved as opposed to arguing about how much it wasted. But nevertheless, this has all been very positive for the state and for CMS because it led us to create a process that is fast becoming a national model. Now, in order to validate what we had saved, we knew we had to create a methodology, a calculator, if you will, that people could trust. To build that calculator, we engaged Deloitte, an internationally respected firm in accounting, business operations, and auditing. The methodology needed to be rigorous so it could pass skeptical audiences. It needed to be robust so it could be applied in a myriad of savings situations. And it needed to be repeatable so we could use it to validate the savings of the past, but on an ongoing basis as well. This methodology was completed last November. And the report describing it and the $529 million in savings has been available on our website since last November. In one of the few areas that's actually positive between the private and public sector, in the public sector, we've been able to share that report with a number of other governmental entities. Government Procurement Journal recently sponsored a workshop where people came to Illinois, 14 other states and governmental entities, to learn about our methodology to take them back home. As I mentioned, the Council of State Governments recently cited our work in Illinois as a national model. And just last month, our savings effort was lauded by the bipartisan National Governors Association as a best practice. We believe this is a major step towards ongoing fiscal control. The second piece of running government like a business is accountability. Now, no one needs to tell business people about accountability. Accountability to your shareholders, to your board of directors, to your boss. But poll after poll shows us that taxpayers don't feel government is accountable. At CMS, we view many of our reforms as a way to make the operations of state government more accountable to taxpayers. Accountability was lacking in Illinois, in part because responsibilities were so unclear. It was hard to know who to hold accountable for what. In the area of accountability, we've taken critical steps to make it clear who's responsible for important government functions. Let me give you an example. The old system of diffused functions and agency silos, it was virtually impossible for the governor to hold anyone accountable for important functions like IT and facilities and legal and audit. So one of the first things Governor Blagojevich did by executive order was to order the consolidation of those functions into central management services. Now, for example, we have the first ever statewide risk assessment and audit plan, meaning that the accountability for auditing is easy to identify, which means it's easy to enforce. Another major step towards accountability was introducing governance to information technology. For years, each agency had its own IT shop that in essence acted like its own fiefdom. They were purchasing what they wanted, how they wanted, from whom they wanted, without any regard to an overall IT strategy. Obviously, this made it virtually impossible to hold anyone accountable for the state's overall IT spend. At times, we didn't even know what that spend was. This is one of the ways that the state ended up with 43 different email systems. Today, our IT governance board reviews every purchase over $5,000. Every agency submits its procurement business case, and we review to make sure it fits within our standards. And if it doesn't, we don't buy it. Having a single standard system will improve operations, enhance security, make employees more efficient, and make it easier to manage and maintain our large systems. Now, remember I said these changes weren't always painless. Well, you can imagine how hard it is to change the behavior of 36 different agencies used to doing things their own way. By and large, they've worked well with us and adopted our new processes. But it's been a lot of effort, and quite frankly, it needed unwavering support from the governor's office. What we fell back on time and time again was the mantra to each agency that we're running the business of government like a business. The third component is change. Businesses that fail to change and adapt will simply not survive. But government has spent decades stubbornly refusing to change. We have forced innovation, sometimes painfully and often reluctantly. But let me share just a couple of examples. Our first technology innovation that we created was to help rural schools, but which ended up playing a very important role in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. As you may know, CMS manages the Illinois Century Network, which links nearly 8,000 institutions such as schools and hospitals to the internet. The ICN delivers high-speed connectivity to Illinois schools, but it doesn't touch the whole state. Specifically, there are areas of Illinois where no telecommunications company has installed high-speed connectivity. And without a big pipe running to these areas, we can't connect them to the ICN. So for rural communities which can't get high-speed telecom service, we used VSAT technology. Essentially, satellite communications that can be installed at a very low cost to connect these rural schools. A real innovation that enables last-mile connectivity in an affordable way. But what we didn't predict is that it would have another great application. 5 days after Katrina ravaged the Gulf Coast, CMS sent our communications trailers and more than 100 employee volunteers to Louisiana, where the infrastructure had been literally wiped out. With satellite communications that no other state could provide, we helped more than 25,000 families in 10 short days receive critical benefits, buy food, and contact loved ones during one of the most desperate times in their life. Another highly significant change we made was to bring knowledge management to state government. A best practice from the private sector, KM is generically the system or process of sharing needed information throughout an enterprise to make it run more efficiently. We built our own homegrown KM system and have since migrated it to the web and worked to extend it throughout the entire state. As Microsoft Chairman Bill Gates said in a speech just last month, our CMS KM network is, quote, a very simple system that's had a very dramatic impact. That means saving the state millions of dollars and also having a learning culture where people are working in a new way. The fourth component is transparency. As a business executive, you need to be able to see inside your organization to see what works and what needs to be improved. In government, the idea of transparency takes on even greater importance because taxpayers need to understand how their public dollars are being spent. Under the prior administration, transparency was virtually impossible because no one really knew exactly what all that spending was buying. CMS couldn't even report at one point on what property it owned or what the overall state IT spend was. It was as if the systems were specifically designed at times to be opaque. KM is nothing but, if not transparent. For example, Illinois can now tap into other states' procurements and contracts to borrow their best practices, benchmark data. But let me use another example to illustrate my argument about transparency. One that may strike you as simplistic, but I can tell you it was as important as anything that we've done. As I've mentioned, prior to this administration, there was no such thing as a statewide IT budget. No way to ascertain what the state was spending overall. So we couldn't measure it. We couldn't have discussions with vendor communities or the press or with the General Assembly. That's as far from transparent as one can possibly get. After lots of hard work, we can now measure and as a result, manage our state's IT spend. 3 years ago, we spent approximately $665 million a year on IT. Last year, we reduced that down to $510 million, a 23% reduction with a savings over 2 years of more than $200 million, while continuing to still invest in new innovative technology like the VSAT program. We've eliminated so much waste and placed the program on such a transparent platform that we're now ready to start making targeted investments again. And we can do it because we now know that the state is spending its money wisely and consistent with an overall strategy. The final business principle we work toward is customer service. Now, a business that ignores its customers will not last very long. But government is the ultimate monopoly. And quite frankly, CMS has not focused on customer service until recently. Our idea of emphasizing customer service would provoke blank stares among people who only knew CMS for its unflattering slang name of can't manage and the S word my mother won't allow me to repeat in public. Now that we've built a new shared services organization, we emphasize customer service. For example, the governor regularly hears as he travels around the state the frustration of business owners around the paperwork associated with state regulation. Much of the information is duplicated from form to form. So getting licensed with the state means filling out the same information again and again. That's why CMS has been working with agencies that serve the business community to streamline the forms and make them available online. Begin to simplify the front end of the regulation process so that when you populate one form, it will populate the next and the next. I'm pleased to report today that more than 1,000 forms that were available only from multiple far-flung sources have now been made available at one site, the governor's business portal, business.illinois.gov. Now we're moving to simplify those forms themselves and to standardize the common information. All of this is a way for state government to operate more like a business and on behalf of you, its customers. So I've described what CMS does, what running government like a business means to us, what the situation looked like when the governor first took office, and what we've done to be more businesslike. Now we get to the fun part, the real lessons learned. I'd like to share with you some of the overarching issues that confronted us and most other public sector entities trying to struggle with the same problem. The first issue I'll call speed versus fairness. In the private sector, we understand that a good plan today often beats a great plan tomorrow, and that decisions need to be made quickly for them to have any effect at all. The public sector, with its emphasis on transparency and inclusion, can often fight or impede speedy decision-making. I know that comes as a shock to many of you. But when we move fast, we risk the perception that not everyone had a fair shot at playing. We confronted this issue head-on early in the administration when we addressed procurement costs. Every month that we labored under uncompetitive deals cost the state millions of dollars, money that we would never get back and that we desperately needed. At the same time, moving too fast to correct the sins of the past would leave some with the impression that the process wasn't fair and open. We moved fast. For example, we began some contracts and some initiatives with vendors before we had fully signed contracts to capture savings quickly, yet recognizing that the vendors bore most of the risk in that relationship. We were later criticized for this practice, even though by moving quickly we saved millions in additional dollars. But we recognize that this remains a unique challenge associated with government that keeps us from moving as quickly as we'd like at times. The struggle between speed and fairness still exists. We know there are dollars lost because we need to be transparent in order to satisfy that double bottom line: financial performance coupled with the transparency that the public sector demands. The second challenge is that, unlike a private enterprise, the government has to competitively bid virtually all of our procurements. I'll call this aspect supply chained. In the private sector, when a company spots an opportunity, the CEO can pick up the phone, call a trusted partner, and begin to implement that virtually immediately. In the public sector, with a few exceptions for emergencies, you have to concern yourself with the competitive bid process for virtually all of your procurements, and that can significantly delay resolution of the problem. In Illinois, the procurement process map under the code we live under was complex and time-consuming. I know this is a bit of an eye chart, but we've made great strides in streamlining the process to cut redundant approvals and speed up the process dramatically while increasing accountability and transparency. We'll never be able to move as quickly or as nimbly as companies in the private sector, but we can change the process to operate faster and, I believe, with greater transparency. A third challenge is the lack of understanding about that classic business reality, which I will call you gotta spend to save. In order for us to produce savings of more than $500 million, we had to spend 73 to bring in core competencies from the private sector, expertise that, quite frankly, we just didn't have in-house. But it's difficult in government to make people understand that you've got to spend money to save money. When we issued our report detailing the validated $529 million in savings, the media focused on the investment rather than the return on investment, even though the savings we achieved exceeded our incremental costs by more than 7 to 1. In one instance, procurement, we spent $14 million but saved more than $200 million. But that investment was later questioned by a state legislator when they asked $14 million would have paid for a lot of state employees. I'm sure that's true, but I'm not so sure that would have been the best way to spend that money. There's no way for us or any large organization to save without spending. So we get criticized by those who don't understand the business concept of return on investment, that you need to make the investment in order to reap the return. A fourth challenge I'll call, we're not France. A recent poll in France found that 75% of young people regard government as a good career choice. Now, I would submit to you today that that may not be the case here in the U.S. The public sector simply doesn't pay competitively with the private sector. So recruiting continues to be a challenge. Although public service for at least a chapter in one's career can be immensely rewarding. Or at least that's what I tell my wife every payday. Jack knows what I'm talking about. I'll talk more about solutions to this in a minute, but the challenge certainly continues today. Since transformation starts with leadership and talent, we need to do more and better in this area. Although I'd like to recognize that we have had some real successes. Some of them are here in this room today. I'd like to just call out a series of names and ask them to stand as a group, a very, very hardworking team. Keith Chambers, Marsha Armstrong, Terry Larkin, Deborah Matlock, Natalie Pedraza, Tony Daniels, Ann McElroy, Mike Smith, Nancy Quass, Shelley Martin, Andy Estep, Jeff Potter, and Justin DeYoung, a very hard-working group of people on behalf of taxpayers of Illinois. I'd be remiss if I didn't also recognize Brian Chapman, our Chief Operating Officer, who couldn't be here today, and people like Jack Hartman, who did a chapter in public service, and I know Kelly's here as well. Government needs a lot more capable leaders like these. The final challenge I would highlight is the one I call building consensus is like building pyramids. By that I mean before you build a pyramid, you better agree on what it's supposed to look like at the end. A huge challenge in the public sector is the lack of a common objective. Set aside the obvious issue that two-party systems are always going to be adversarial to a certain extent. More importantly, it is clear to me that different players in the public sector view outcomes very differently. Let me give you one final example. As a business person over procurement, I look at a contract as an opportunity to get value at a lower cost. I see reducing the cost of a widget as an objective good. But buying widgets in greater bulk via a statewide master contract might impact small businesses whose contracts have now been bundled into a statewide contract. And the state agency that buys the widget sees the cost as sees the lower cost as nice, but their primary objective is continuity in the supplier relationship in support of their program. To a legislator, if the new widget manufacturer is from Iowa instead of Illinois, the state may save money, but their constituent in their district isn't getting that money anymore. And the press may say the winning bidder once made a campaign contribution to the administration, ignoring the fact that all losers may have done so as well. So all of us are looking at the same situation, but where I see success and a positive gain, others see risk and failure. This example is just one of many that takes place every day in state government. We have equal numbers of people that will tell us that spending less is good or bad. That having 13,000 fewer employees is either good or bad. That having more centralized control over IT spending is either good or bad. The reality is it's both, depending on where you stand on the issue. Now let me be clear, this is by no means a comprehensive list of the challenges that we've faced, but it brings me to my overall message today. There's only one way to bridge these gaps, to continue these improvements, to run the business of government like a business on a sustainable basis. And that is to have better and more frequent dialogue between the public and the private sector. Frankly, government hasn't always done that good of a job at this. I believe we've made great strides over the last 3 years, but I believe we need to do better. So I ask the question again. Can you run the business of government like a business? I believe you can. I believe CMS has proven that over these last 3 years, including validated savings of more than $500 million. And again, why are those savings so important? Because they've allowed the governor to put less money into systems and more money into education and health care and public safety without raising sales or income taxes. Yet despite our progress, government still needs to keep pushing for improvement. Redundant systems still abound. As this slide attests, the state still has 9 different payroll systems, 38 for HR, and 104 different accounting systems. These issues are targeted for the next phase of shared services, which will take advantage of what we've learned these last 3 years at CMS. As we work to tackle these next challenges, I need your help. Now, I'm not suggesting even with everyone in this room actively engaged in the discussion that we're going to solve all of these issues. I mentioned pyramids earlier, and these problems have been around in government since the time of the pyramids. But I do believe that our story shows that you can make government run more efficiently if you use private sector best practices and you employ the partnership of the private sector. Now, if I haven't convinced you today that the answer to my question is yes, I urge you to please reach out and contact me. In fact, I have 2 things to ask from you today. First, if you have an innovative idea, bring it to us. Don't just come selling your product or your goods and services, but let's have a real debate about how your goods and services can help us run government more like a business. Second, if you've got a bright employee with solid business experience who's looking for their next challenge, send them to me, or to another state, or to the federal government. Private sector leaders can and should lend their business expertise to government. Maybe not for the rest of their lives, but for a significant and important chapter in their lives. In closing, let me again just thank the City Club and Jay for the opportunity to speak today. I'd like to answer any questions you may have, but please, let's use this as a chance to open up a dialogue and keep it going. Thank you.
If you have questions, just go to the microphone there and state your name. We're on cable TV, so you have questions, sir?
I do. Bernard Edelman, President of South Street Council and Attorney. You talked about some consolidations. I guess those are functions, not agencies?
Yes, if you're referring to the slide at the end there, the next phase of shared services is not going to involve consolidation of agencies. As you know, in the first administration, in addition to this, we consolidated certain agencies into revenue, and Department of Professional Regulation consolidated certain agencies. This is more focused on systems. The governor is very focused on spending more on people and less on systems. And as you can see, we still have far too many systems, and technology can help us take the efficiencies that we've started 3 years ago and continue them.
And is that done, or when will that be done?
Well, we're in the midst of doing it right now. If you look at the governor's budget address, he laid out what shared services part 2. It's a long-term project. I mean, none of this is simple, as many of the people in this room know. It's a multi-year initiative, but it begins to put us on a platform where we can take the efficiencies we've done over the last 3 years and extend them even further.
Thank you.
My name is Gene Forgetto. I have a question regarding the counties and other units of government in Illinois, and to what degree do you share your approach and your techniques with the other governmental units? You had mentioned that other states came here and looked at what you're doing, but it seems like it'd be of value to other units.
Great question. Thanks for asking. We actually have a program called the Joint Purchasing Program, and it allows local municipalities to purchase off our state contracts. So much of the savings, the more than $200 million in savings out of that 529, was when we sourced goods and services throughout the state. And any municipality can piggyback off one of our contracts to get those same savings. But in addition, we did the workshop that can help states understand, once they actually do the sourcing or piggyback off one of our contracts, how to take our methodology that's very robust and very repeatable and apply it in their own municipality so they can understand how much money they actually saved.
Leighton Olson from the law firm of Howe & Hutton and the Midwest Technology Access Group. Realize you've been recently appointed to the governor's advisory committee on Eliminate the Digital Divide. I was wondering if you could give some comments from that perspective, perhaps, and also the digital government planning and how perhaps a cross-section of consumers might be able to be participating with the government agencies and the vendors to make sure that people can understand and be able to access digital government services, perhaps.
Sure, thank you. Well, I think the key to that is the Illinois Century Network. I alluded to it earlier, but that is the largest publicly run network in the world. And when we first came in, the capacity was maybe at, I want to say, 20 or 25%. And what we've done is increase the capacity threefold and are signing up more law enforcement agencies and more schools. And, of course, the VSAC technology is allowing us to do that. The enabling legislation right now for the Illinois Century Network doesn't really allow us to extend it to the private sector, but Julie Hamos, a representative from Evanston, is right now holding hearings on this very issue in an effort to try and figure out whether or not there's a way to pass some legislation and take the Illinois Century Network and use it to extend it out to areas where the digital divide is creating those very issues.
How you doing? Lawrence Hayes, Chicago communicator and the Omnibus TV station. My question is that the governor had made promises to do more diversity and also contracts to the African American community. What is his plan to do that? Because we haven't seen very much of that.
Well, we do have a plan, and I would suggest that there have been real improvements. A couple of things I'll just mention briefly, and then if you want to, we've got some of the folks here that actually head that, and you can talk to them right afterwards. We have a very aggressive small business set-aside program that in fiscal year 05 had a net increase of about $16 million in contracts to small businesses. About half of those went to minority and women-owned businesses. But maybe more importantly, we shifted a policy about a year ago that now makes it mandatory on many large contracts that a majority firm will be required to partner with a women-owned or minority firm as a subcontractor. And if they don't, their bid will be deemed non-responsive. Now, as you know, you can't do that across the board, and you have to look at each procurement on a case-by-case basis to determine what's the appropriate percentage. When we put out our office supply contract, we had a 19% goal. So that's a $25 million contract over multiple years, and 19% of that will go to minority businesses. We recently put out an RFP through DHS to web enable their food stamp program, and the participation requirement there was 25%. So we are growing the numbers, and in addition to the outreach that we've done, 60 workshops around the state, increasing the number of firms, and we're looking for many more qualified minority and diverse firms to sign up for our program because we believe we've made great progress in streamlining the process and enhanced the number of opportunities for firms like yours.